To Westminster and to Windsor. Everyone from the Emperor of Japan to the President of the United States in London for the final farewell to Great Britain's Queen of 70 years. But it wasn't just the high and mighty packing into the Abbey where Elizabeth's coronation was televised all those years ago. This time, the whole world's in the room, partly thanks to the digital age. They're tuning in because they can, an estimated 1 billion people watching on television. And because whether you're a Republican or a Royalist, well, she's part of our lives. The only queen that 94% of the world's population has ever known in 2022, a hereditary monarch whose icons include jeweled crowns and an orb, can seem like a throwback to the past. But it's a moment that matters to a kingdom that reveres the national unity she personified in times of discord. For the rest of the planet, is it the attraction of a fairy tale with familiar faces, or the devotion to duty that Elizabeth incarnated? Can Charles III pick up that mantle? Or is it truly, with this state funeral, the end of an era? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the final farewell to Queen Elizabeth. And with us from Windsor, correspondent Bénédicte Paviot. Thanks for being with us.
On this historic and moving day.
Laura Carter, lecturer in British history at the University of Paris-Cité. Thanks for being with us as well. Adrian Rod, senior lecturer in British history and contemporary issues at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po.
Thank you.
And from the Indian capital, Delhi, Jyota Atwal, also professor of history at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Welcome to the show. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. And really what we just witnessed caps 11 momentous days. The transfer of power is complete. His Majesty's crown jeweler removing the orb, scepter, and crown from the top of Queen Elizabeth's coffin there. A short while ago, where you're standing, Bénédicte Paviot, just remind our viewers once again why this particular moment in a day replete with rite and ritual was so important.
That moment is so important because they are the symbols of that royal power. The orb, the scepter, those are, and the crown. That is absolutely capital. And those were handed to Her Majesty the Queen on her coronation day in the very same Westminster Abbey. And therefore, it is those symbols that are then withdrawn since she has died. And therefore, she is no longer, perforce, the monarch. She's been replaced immediately by King Charles III, and that is the new reality. He will choose to have his coronation when he chooses to have it. It doesn't have to be immediate. He's been proclaimed king, and if anybody was to dispute that, it would be an act of treason.
So, let me put it to you, Adrian Rod. I mean, it's the 21st century, right? So you need an orb, which I think represents what, the spiritual realm.
That's right.
And you need the
scepter.
The scepter, which is represent, and the crown. Are these the needed props for the legitimacy of a government in our?
Well, for the legitimacy of a monarch, yes, because the whole point of the monarchy, or one of the main points of the monarchy, is to embody the long history of the nation, a certain sense of continuity with the past. And I think one of the ways in which that is acceptable to the population, apart from the fact, of course, that the monarch has no political power, is precisely that it is wrapped up in symbolism, in the form of mysticism, that gives it a certain aura, that makes it, that makes it acceptable to the general population.
What did you think watching a ceremony that was obviously carefully scripted, perhaps even planned decades ago.
It was. It did start to be planned many decades ago. And, well, what we saw in this particular ceremony was the very traditional, very historical aspects, which, of course, Queen Elizabeth herself was consulted on and which she felt would be appropriate. What I think will be interesting and perhaps a little different will be the coronation of King Charles III, where he might want to introduce some elements of modernity while also preserving, of course, these long-standing traditions.
Right. You heard Adrian Rod there, Laura, use the word continuity. I mean, this is a monarch who reigned for 70 years. It's been 11 days since Elizabeth's passing. It's still a little bit of a shock, though, isn't it? To see, we saw at one point the new king walking into Westminster Abbey. Behind him, the new Prince of Wales, and behind him, a little boy who one day will be king.
Yeah, but I think even that procession, in a way, is part of the continuity. I very much agree that preserving the tradition delicately is a huge part of this. So, yes, we've got a big change with a new monarch, but it's all... In fact, it's at the very basis, I think, of the constitutional monarchy to have continuity, to have change, but have it gradually evolve. And I think that's kind of King Charles's challenge, right, is to bring in change but not do it in a way that is too fast or too drastic. So I think we're going to see a lot of that, a reminder of links with his mother's reign, but also perhaps with the coronation, some slow and gradual changes that he'll bring in. But, the faces, the Prince of Wales and his son George, we're already kind of habituated to them and we see them. So I think it feels to me like it will all be very managed, and that continuity is actually really at the absolute heart of this. Change we can't stop when someone dies, but the continuity can be managed.
So was this Elizabeth's day or the British monarchy's day?
I think it was Elizabeth's day. And perhaps at the coronation we'll see more of the question of sustaining the monarchy and renewing the monarchy for future decades. But I think the queue and all the people there pouring out their love to this individual person and what she did was about her, much like we perhaps felt at the Jubilee.
Jyoti Atwal, again, it's this this separation of the instruments of state from the body of the late monarch we showed with that ceremony inside of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, at Windsor Castle. Again, it's the 21st century. Your thoughts on that?
Well, we've been glued to the television as well here in Delhi. I think the point about continuity is so important here. But at the same time, I'd like to say that Queen, over the 70 good years of her reign, had transformed the way you look at monarchy. And I think that was remarkable. I mean, many people have spoken about it, read in the media about it. And in that sense, of course, continuity is not just there in these ceremonies, funerals or weddings, and I think also universities, which are all over the world, where in the commonwealth countries particularly, some of the universities and educational institutions do continue this kind of tradition. I've seen in Ireland and other places where this is continuing. And you also have, some kind of allegiance to Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah, because we spoke to former Attorney General Dominic Grieve, and he argued that it's important for us, he says, to have a monarchy because that way the politicians, I'm paraphrasing here what he said, but it cuts them down to size, and that in that they're never going to get too big for their britches, since they've all sworn an allegiance to someone who represents the unity of the nation.
Sure. I think what Queen Elizabeth II was able to do is something which is remarkable, and that is that she was able to, make herself be known as a person, Queen as a person rather than as monarchy. Of course, we have all kinds of problems. People are wanting apology from her or any monarch, an apology for what happened in India, especially the violence of imperial violence that had happened. So there are these moments, but yet she was the head of the Commonwealth, and I think that is the most remarkable point. And also she influenced the foreign policy in several ways. That is the most important part here.
How did you feel as though she personally influenced foreign policy?
Well, yes. I think in terms of Commonwealth, she also, even with, in India, she modernized it. It now includes issues like gender, environment, labor. These are the new issues that have come up, and I think it has happened under her aegis. And that's the most remarkable part, of being generous, of being giving, of, apart from the cultural remnants, that's very, very, very important in India. We have the buggy culture and the darbar culture, which we do remember. And we are trying to decolonize at the moment in India, symbolic decolonization at least. We are renaming our roads, monuments.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I want to bring back what you said a moment ago about duty and service, because what we saw was crowds 7 rows deep, lined up along the procession route before dawn. A moment of communion for those who came from near and far ahead of that ceremony this Monday at Westminster Abbey.
Yeah, he did.
Since 6 o'clock this morning, we tried to go closer to Hyde Park Corner and the Wellington Arch, where they're going to be transferring the coffin into the hearse, but we weren't able to get any closer. It was always going to be a long wait, and it might rain, it could get quite cold, so you need to be prepared.
She was our monarch, she was our constant, and I just want to say goodbye to her. I just want to pay my respects.
So I was in the military for 10 years, and I just felt that I needed to come and do this for me and say goodbye and say thank you for everything that she's done.
Bénédicte Pavio, this is so interesting. We heard from that veteran there, that ex-servicewoman, because there's those who say, the monarchy, it's privileged, entitled people. Why do we care? And here, what you're hearing from these people is, no, these people. She represents the sacrifice that you make for the communal good. And we've heard a lot of that from a lot of people who, by the way, a lot of those people outside the gates of Buckingham Palace are waiting online to queue to walk past her coffin this past week that you've been speaking to. They're not from privileged backgrounds.
No, they're not. And they connect with her. They respect her. They have affection for her. We were outside Buckingham Palace before the news broke of her death. We were then there for 2 days or 3 days. Once the news had broken, we spoke to people coming spontaneously, families, from all over the United Kingdom, from all over the world, wanting to be there, talking to each other, talking to strangers, bringing flowers, lighting candles. Quite extraordinary to witness. We were then for 3 days by Lambeth Bridge as people in their thousands, not just from, again, all over the United Kingdom, but from Japan, from India, from Canada, everywhere just about. Quite extraordinary. Military, sometimes as well, saying that she had given 70 years, surely they could give a few hours, braving the cold, braving the night. When I went in to see the lying in state of Her Majesty the Queen, again, seeing that reverence, that respect, and also the weight of responsibility that one felt from the army there, from the parliamentary staff, that weight of responsibility to do their duty. But let me hark back to the Archbishop of Canterbury during this state funeral today, Justin Welby. I think he talked about her Christian faith, her belief in Jesus Christ, how that she saw that really as a vocation. Let's remember, originally she wasn't destined, it seemed, well, at all to be queen. It's because her uncle abdicated, her father became king, that she then, the princess, became, and some say that was almost the making of her. And then that sacrifice, that duty, that pledge she made, indeed, in Westminster Abbey, the fact that she chose Prince Philip, and that combination of characters and as they forge their way. And what the Archbishop of Canterbury talked about today is a lifetime of service. And what was fascinating to watch was all those leaders, the US President Joe Biden, Jacinda Ardern, the UK Prime Minister Liz Truss, who, when she was much younger, was against the monarchy. She's on record as actually thinking that nobody should be born to rule. Here she is, UK Prime Minister, but then she was also a not a Brexiteer, she was against Brexit and has become a Brexiteer. So people are allowed to change their minds. But that lifetime of service is what comes back again and again, and that is what has forced the respect. And when the Archbishop of Canterbury talked about the fact that leaders often come to power thinking that they are there to be served. And in fact, he said, what they are there for is to serve. And he said that Queen Elizabeth understood that profoundly and touched countless lives over those 70 years. Yeah. Oh, to be a fly in the wall, or to know what could have gone through the US president, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, or others' minds. And I think it's interesting when sometimes prominent deaths happen like that. Instead of being in New York, they're in London. Is there a moment where they have a quick conversation or they reflect on their behaviour? Who knows? Let's hope it's beneficial.
Let's hope it's beneficial. Adrian Rod, when you hear Bénédicte Pavillon mention the Archbishop of Canterbury, give that eulogy, he's a eulogy for what's effectively his former boss. Officially, right, Britain's a theocracy. There's an official religion. And the monarch is the head of the Church of England. So it's very difficult to explain how is all this compatible with democracy. I suppose your students must ask you that all the time here.
Yes, they do. Of course, that's what's interesting teaching in France, where, of course, French students have been brought up to be taught that democracy is the values of the Republic, is the inheritance of the French Revolution. There are, I think, two answers to your question. The first is that the role of the monarchy is symbolic. It provides a link with history, but the Queen had no power to make any decisions. All she could do was have weekly a private conversation with her Prime Minister, where she could make the Prime Minister aware of her concerns, of her recommendations, but without that being binding in any sense on the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister then exercised the executive power and was free to do whatever she or he wished to do. Regarding the role of the Queen as head of the Church, you're right that there are, of course, questions about that, just as there are questions and recurring criticism at the presence of bishops and archbishops of the Church of England in the House of Lords, where they actually do have voting power. The Queen's role, of course, she had no power to make any decisions for the Church. There as well, her role was. I'm still not entirely used to speaking of the Queen in the past tense.
Not to do, but to be, said one historian.
That's right. To be simply an embodiment of history, an embodiment of tradition, and an embodiment of certain values. So where kings and queens in the past, in the 16th century, of course, had a real power, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, in shaping what the Church would be, she's simply the heir to that tradition and the embodiment of a long period of history.
A long period of history, and here in France, well, there was no public holidays. She wasn't our queen. Although there were a few tributes. We saw, for instance, the metro station on the Champs-Élysées, Georges V for the day, George V station, renamed Elizabeth II station, George the Fifth, one of her predecessors there. Laura Carter, what do you think of the coverage here in France of the Queen's funeral? Do you think are you surprised by how much or how little of it there is?
I think it's probably just a case of it being available if you want it, whereas I suppose the difference is in the UK, it's unescapable even for people who perhaps don't want to engage with it. So in France, obviously, we continue, and we do in the UK, to hear about the war in Ukraine and developments about that as kind of the major and top news stories. So it's available here, but it's not necessarily kind of forced upon you in the way that it sort of is in the UK, because it's a public holiday. Operations in hospitals have been cancelled, and people have opinions about that. So and the UK is in 10 days of mourning. So I think for British people or for fans of the monarchy abroad, everything has been available as well, sort of via the BBC, via YouTube. So.
And do the French, I mean, we've spent the first part of this show trying to explain it. Do the French get Britain's monarchy? I mean, a hereditary monarchy coupled with a parliamentary democracy?
I think it's, for the layperson, it is perhaps something that's a little bit hard to understand, and people do tend to go back to history and to the French Revolution and to kind of go back to stereotypes about the end of the French Ancien Régime. I think actually the spectacle of today and the question of, why did everyone watch, why did everyone see that, I think a big part of that was maybe learning to kind of understand this institution a bit. And if we think about why did so many people from all over the world go to Westminster, certainly I, watching it, thought, well, it's for this extremely ordered spectacle that the Brits do well, and it is something really of a spectacle, I think.
For a spectacle, so you're saying is that she doesn't. It's more for the pageantry. She doesn't.
I think in this case it's for Elizabeth II as a person, as we've discussed, but right. I think there was a lot in it today. The objects you were talking about, the orb and the scepter, the imperial crown, and it's not just the crown, it's the imperial crown. Those are things that people kind of want to see as kind of, beautiful, sparkling objects that they associate with perhaps fairly superficial ideas about what the British state is.
The world indeed came to Westminster. Everyone from the Emperor of Japan, Joe Biden, Emmanuel Macron, President Bolsonaro of Brazil, who's got an election coming up, Sudan's strongman, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, not to mention the leaders of 56 Commonwealth nations.
Her late Majesty famously declared on a 21st birthday broadcast that her whole life would be dedicated to serving the nation and Commonwealth. Rarely has such a promise been so well kept.
Jyoti Atwal, your reaction listening to the Archbishop of Canterbury?
Yeah, I think it's remarkable that there are so many people turned up, and the heads of the nations turned up. We had our president who attended the ceremony, and I think it's very natural that they turned up, because one of the, as has been said, spectacle. But apart from that, I want to go back to the earlier question about whether it is this kind of church service and allegiance to religion is compatible with modern democracy. I think all over the world, religion is not been thrown out of the window. In fact, we are living in a multicultural world where nationalism is something which is under threat in that sense, and many nations are now asserting their nationalism through religion. And whether we subscribe or not to that sort of nationalism is a different idea. It's a different debate altogether. But religion is an acceptable entity in the present day. So it does coexist with modernity and democracy. That is one thing which we, as historians, we've realized over a period of time. And also we must realize that in Britain there are 1.4 million Indian people, Brits of Indian origin. So there is a kind of appeal, which United Kingdom has, which is a pull factor, which it has to pull the various, multicultural people, multi-religious people to the country. I think that is something very important about United Kingdom, and you see these this enormous, huge numbers turning up because of that.
Laura Carter?
Yeah, I think on this question of faith, it's actually an important point to dwell on. If we think about Elizabeth II and her generation, she's of a generation that was a church-going generation. Almost all of the population would have described themselves as religious in some way, and mostly Christian when she came to the throne. Clearly that's not the case today, but as my colleague said, the UK is now a multicultural nation, and we've heard a lot today about the Queen's faith. I think it was described as profound and simple, but I think a few days ago we already heard King Charles emphasizing diversity. So perhaps faith is something that, when we think about changes or gradual changes, might also be perhaps something that's less emphasized because of his, he's an Anglican too, but he seems to want to be stressing diversity and multiculturalism. And I think, he should be, because in the news just in the last few days, we've had unrest between Muslim and Hindu populations in the city of Leicester. I mean, there's many things kind of brewing under the surface in multicultural Britain that are important and need to be addressed, and that the monarch needs to be kind of abreast of. So, the Anglican faith was the Queen's faith, but it's also it's a very flexible religion, and there needs to be space for a lot of other.
Those incidents in Leicester, Ejinrod, they have a religious undertone to them. The monarch, by asserting the fact that they are the guarantor of the Church of Scotland, that they are the head of the Church of England, does that sort of take the conversation off the table, but make it that they pay tribute and nod to the spiritual realm?
It doesn't exactly take the conversation off the table. It's a balance that the royal family, I think, has been starting to try to find. The Queen herself, for quite a few years now, has at times wanted to reflect the diversity, the multicultural diversity of Britain. If you watch her recent Christmas broadcasts, for example, they depict her visiting multicultural areas, multicultural institutions of Britain, and wanting to show an inclusive image of the nation of which she was Queen. And indeed, Prince Charles, as he was, King Charles as he is now, has long shown an interest in wanting to be a promoter of interfaith dialogue, interfaith understanding, and of wanting to defend the importance of faith in general, not specifically of the Anglican faith. Of course, that is going to be an increasing challenge, because fewer and fewer British people are believers. I think it was a YouGov poll last year that suggested that only about a quarter of the British population actually believes in God.
Does that weaken the monarchy?
What it means is that the monarchy is going to have to continue to adapt. I think the connection between the monarchy and the church cannot disappear overnight. It remains important for many people, particularly people of an older generation. But I think the royal family has found the right path, which is to maintain that historical connection to the church, while at the same time emphasizing that it is not an exclusive connection, and that the nation is not explicitly or exclusively an Anglican one.
Yeah, you heard there Jyoti Atwal mentioning that India at the funeral, represented by its president. On the day of the Queen's death, Nationalist Prime Minister Narendra Modi happened to be in the Indian capital for the inauguration at India Gate of an 8.5-meter tall statue of Subhas Chandra Bose. He defied British rule. The inauguration, part of 75th Independence Anniversary commemorations.
Today, the thinking and the behaviour of the country are both getting liberated from the colonial mindset. This liberation will take us to the goal of a developed India.
So those remarks Jyoti Atwal made before, obviously, we knew the Queen was dying, and Narendra Modi sending a heartfelt tweet to the British. Nonetheless, he wasn't present in London. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you see, overall, this kind of, India is going through some kind of cultural, symbolic decolonization. And I'm not surprised at the fact that this is going on. But at the same time, we have a day of mourning for the Queen. The flags were at half-mast on Sunday. And I think that is again, that reiterates the fact that although we might want to show ourselves as anti-colonial and decolonizing, there is some kind of respect and honor that has been imparted to this kind of moment of the crown, departure of a monarch. Because, as I said earlier, it is not. She presented herself as a person, not so much as a monarch. And during her visits in 1961, then 83, and then 1997, these were the visits which were very important. And I think media has been analyzing, Indian media has been analyzing those visits. And in 1961, it was a continuation of the Darbar culture, which was also very well received. So it's a cultural remnant of the British Empire. It is, which is more acceptable rather than the political remnant. So replacement of the statue, of the filling up of the canopy by Subhash Chandra Bose's statue is a phenomena that brings us back to our, who are our own heroes. We have to re-establish them against the colonial heroes, against the so-called colonial actors. So I think that's a process which is separate from the process of internationalizing and global India. So I think there are two images which Mr. Modi represents at the moment. And at this point, I think we have to strike a balance between the two.
And let me ask you about this, GOT, because here in France, we've never had a big formal apology ceremony for atrocities committed during Algeria's War of Independence. Is an apology something that should come for atrocities committed under British rule from the monarch or from the prime minister?
Actually, I feel, as a historian, as a thinker, I feel that it should come from the monarch, because the British rule, colonialism, imperialism was carried out in the name of the crown, not the prime minister. And prime minister is an elected head. He's not somebody who represents the monarchy. And the burden of apology, which has not yet come, falls on the shoulders of the new king. And that is very obvious. Whenever he visits India, although he's been doing a lot of charity and he has a very good reputation of being with India and British trusts and so on. He raised £4 million for the COVID welfare and hospitals and so on. But at the same time, for the 1919 Jallianwala Bagh killings, which is an unforgettable and unforgivable tragedy in India, I think the apology is pending. And the apology might not correct, there's no correction of the wrongdoing, but it will heal. It will put a closure to some kind of oppression, violent oppression that one has seen. Of course, the violence was also unleashed during the World War II, one in which the British soldiers participated, in which the British Indian soldiers participated in huge numbers, but they did it in a voluntary way. But this was a firing that was opened, on innocent people, and that is unforgivable. I think that needs an apology.
That needs an apology, you're saying. Adrian, just for our viewers, if such an apology were to come, how does it work? It's the king reading what the prime minister tells him to say.
Exactly, that's what it would be.
So this is not Charles's decision.
No, it can't be. I mean, it's a perfectly understandable need. We're hearing this from India, we're hearing this from parts of Africa, we're hearing this from many of the Caribbean islands, this expectation, and it's perfectly understandable given indeed the long history of colonial atrocities and crimes. However, the king cannot take the initiative of expressing an apology of himself. Constitutionally, he can only act on the advice is the official expression, which means he can only do as the Prime Minister asks him to do. And that is quite natural because he's not an elected figure. He doesn't have that legitimacy to act on his own initiative. He can only do as the democratically elected Prime Minister, representing the will of the people, asks or tells him to do.
And a state funeral is an occasion where world leaders rub elbows. Every state funeral dating back from, you could say, from JFK to today. And Bénédicte Pavio, at this particular funeral, of course, much was made of the fact that the Russian president was not invited. There were others who were not on that list, including the coup leaders in Myanmar. Others were, like the coup leaders in Sudan. So your thoughts on who was in the room and who wasn't?
Well, the major players were there. Very few countries were not invited. There was a controversy about who would be invited and who came from China. I think it was the vice president who came, and there are MPs currently sitting in the House of Commons who have been banned by China. And the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, made it very clear that he did not think it was appropriate for the Chinese to come to the parliamentary estate. However, I gather, and I saw some pictures, and I think that they did come, for example, to the lying in state in Westminster Hall. But as I said, the great majority of leaders were there. And as I think I said before, I think, and as you're alluding to, I think it is these kinds of unforeseen events, since we've been expecting, alas, and the monarch was 96. We knew it was coming. We didn't know when it would be. And as Boris Johnson said in an eloquent tribute last Friday, I think it was, she lulled us into a sense that she was almost eternal. But it came, and when it came, these world leaders who are extremely busy have changed their timetables, and instead of being at the UN General Assembly, have delayed it and have come to London. And there will be, some of them, Justin Trudeau, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of Albanese of Australia, did go in for short political meetings on Saturday or Sunday with Liz Truss, the new UK Prime Minister. But Downing Street was at pains to underline that these were not full bilaterals, full bilats, and that we would get no readout. Yes, the US President was due to have a meeting with Liz Truss. Could it have been because there was a rather spectacular headline in one of the British papers saying that Liz Truss would be telling the US President about Brexit and sorting out the Northern Protocol? Who knows? But the fact is that that meeting is now going to take place, which seems more appropriate anyway, in the US. So there will have been conversations, and people, remember those leaders, a lot of those leaders, not the US President, were put on buses for environmental reasons, for security reasons, because it's been compared that today, the state funeral, and Sunday and Monday particularly, you normally get 2 state visits a year, and it was like getting suddenly the security, logistics, and nightmare for the intelligence services and the police of 100 state visits in 1 or 2 days. It was huge, 10,000 police, lots of intelligence services, military, etc. deployed. And we've had no incident, which of course is very important. So there will have been conversations that will have been begun, and certainly for Liz Truss, this is an extraordinary opportunity for her to be having these softly meetings. I think she's going to have a very rude awakening, which we won't belabor here, but in the House of Commons, she was not the number 1 choice of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. She was the number 2 or number 3 choice. And the cost of living bold economic plan she's presented has had very little scrutiny. We've had, perforce, because of the death of the monarch, on the very day that she presented that plan in the House of Commons, Parliament's been suspended, and people's cost of living, 10% inflation, strikes in trains, in postal strikes and others, that hasn't gone away. Those bills are still arriving in people's homes and also businesses, and they simply don't see that bold economic plan, and it's not doing anything particularly good for the markets and the pound either. So I think that's of another day. Meanwhile, Liz Truss is going to go to the UN General Assembly and meet more leaders.
Yeah, Laura Carter, let me ask you, because you heard there Bénédicte Pavio mention what in effect sounds, if we believe the reports, like a snub on the part of Joe Biden. He'll say, I'll see you Wednesday in New York when we're all at the UN General Assembly. Is it is it an anecdote that shows that perhaps today's ceremony shows that the stature of this queen and this throne is bigger perhaps than the stature of post-Brexit Britain at this point?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that analysis. I think we know very well that Joe Biden is very invested in the question of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that it remains a huge sticking point between the European Union and the United Kingdom. And much like her predecessor, it's not really clear, although she has put forward a very kind of strong edge on that, it's not really clear how Liz Truss is going to handle it. But we know that Joe Biden is, of course, very interested in, first and foremost, protecting the Belfast Agreement. So I think absolutely, when we go back to what Benedict was saying earlier about all these people from a range of social classes coming to London to pay their respects, and quite invested in this old-fashioned idea of deference that we maybe think has subsided in British culture between the classes, that was still there for Elizabeth II, I think. You know, people know she's a member of the aristocracy, but they pay respects to her service. The gulf between that and the sort of estimation that ordinary people have of politicians, probably since 2008, 2009, is enormous. And I think it's only being highlighted when we see all these sort of memes of Liz Truss at the funeral and at the ceremony. So, things will move forward, and we'll have the economic plan, but the gap.
So what you're saying is
clear.
it's not the end of an era for the monarchy. What you're saying is that the politicians, because they're divisive, because there's so much vitriol, it's going to make, by contrast, the monarchy look stronger?
I'm not sure the monarchy looks stronger. I think Elizabeth II's reign looks stronger, and she represents a form of legitimacy, a form of earned power and respect that politicians can't live up to. And I think the question of Charles and the monarchy is a different one, right? We were going back to the questions about decolonising. That's a huge thing that he's going to have to handle. It's not really clear. I was just thinking when my colleagues were speaking about how so far the question of decolonising the curriculum and all those movements in domestic Britain have been focused on institutions, on education, on pulling down statues. We've had a few statues of Queen Victoria, the Empress of India, defaced, but it's very much felt like the monarchy was off limits under Elizabeth II, apart from these calls for apologies. And I think that under King Charles is going to be a different question.
Jyoti Atwal, you agree?
Yes, I agree absolutely. But I also want to add that there is the face of anti-colonial movement and anti-imperial movement has changed over a period of time, because the West, particularly Great Britain, has also, pulled Indian students, for education and for other things. Commonwealth has created scholarships for students, teachers, training purposes, etc. So there is this anger which has been diluted over a period of time. And I think this anti-imperial has now taken shape of rights, human rights, rights for, environment, rights as a group which has come up rather than being anti-colonial. So I think King Charles has to now face that kind of new form of anti-colonialism rather than stick to the old forms.
Ajin Rod, can he live with the times? Can he change with the times? He's been, contrary to his mother, who, when she was born, didn't know that she'd one day become queen. He's known it for a long time that he'd be king.
Yes, he's had many decades to prepare, of course. If we stay on that particular issue of movements reassessing history and the expectations that are sort of invested in the monarch, it brings us back to the issue that we were addressing earlier. He cannot apologize. What he has already done, he cannot apologize in the name of the crown. What he has already done is express, for instance, on the history of slavery, his deep personal sorrow, and Prince William has done the same. But you'll note it's personal, and he expressed it as his personal sorrow, and it's sorrow, it's not an apology. Because
And that, again, as we said, depends.
Yeah, he can do that personally, but he can't go further than that without the Prime Minister asking him to do so.
All right, it depends what happens over at Downing Street and in the House of Commons. I want to thank you, Adrian Rudd, Laura Carter, Jyoti Atwal in Delhi, Bénédicte Pavio reporting for us from Windsor on this day of the Queen's funeral. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.